Professor Jeremy Jones, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. I'm very much happy to have you. How is work and your family?
We're good here. Can't complain too much. The kids are at home doing online schooling, so that keeps us busy.
Okay. I see. Professor Jeremy Jones, I'm happy to have you for this episode of the conversation to discuss your article, Nothing is Straight in Zimbabwe, the Rise of the Kukiya Economy, which is a study that is primarily based on the time from 2000 to 2008. I believe this was an outstanding article that is worth discussing and worth talking about at this platform. I do have some questions for you today, but first and foremost, I just want to understand and I just want to hear from you, from your perspective, how and when you developed interests in Zimbabwean history, or let's say in studying the Zimbabwean economy.
Yeah, I first went to Zimbabwe in 1994 as an undergraduate. That was a study abroad program. There were quite a few study abroad programs in Zimbabwe from the United States at that point. But this particular one was with my own college, that's Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And we spent a term in Zimbabwe in various places, Kumusha, but also in Chitungwiza. That's the relevant point here. So I met a bunch of people in Chitungwiza at that point. After I graduated, I worked some here in the US, and then took up a position with an NGO in Chitungwiza. So I went there to Chitungwiza at the start of 1999, right after the bread riots in Chitungwiza. And I worked at that particular place until the end of 2000, and was there in Zimbabwe a bit longer afterwards before I went to graduate school. So during my time in Chitungwiza, we were working with youth, young people, school leavers, and that's really where my interest in that population and the sort of challenges that they face came from. I went back to graduate school here in the US at University of Chicago, and that's when I decided to go back to Zimbabwe and do my anthropological field work there, and that started in 2006 full time, although I went back and forth throughout the early 2000s.
Oh, wonderful. You mentioned in this article that you received some research grants for carrying out this study, and you received funds from the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, the Nordic Africa Institute, the Fulbright Hayes Dissertation Research Grant, and one other from the University of Chicago. Can you just briefly describe how one can get these grants and how they are managed? I'm sure that many academics and scholars who would want to engage in research might be very interested to know about these grants.
Yeah, the Chicago one is obviously internal to students at the University of Chicago. The NSF and Fulbright would be competitive grants for graduate students in a variety of disciplines, but I think the programs that I got, you have to be a US citizen to get those. There are, however, programs in both organizations that you can get funding for non-citizens to do things. The Nordic Africa Institute is a really interesting sort of think tank And I would encourage people to look at the programs that they have on their website. There have been a number of Zimbabwean scholars who've gone through there, including Amin Kamete. Amanda Hammer was there for a long time. So you can check their website for funding possibilities. I also got money from Codestria during that period. I don't remember if I put that in the Kukiya acknowledgements, but Codestria, if I can give a shout out to them, they also have a lot of really interesting funding possibilities for scholars, especially scholars who are located in Africa and working out of African institutions. And they're always doing something. So I would encourage people to look on their website and see what kind of funding calls there are. I don't know, did that cover all of them?
Yeah, sure.
There are others that are out there that you could look at. SSRC, Social Science Research Council here in the US, the ACLS, which is also here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
They do fund African scholars.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure many people interested in research might want to look into them so that they can carry their own researches.
Yeah.
With some funds, it's always important. So my first question for you, Professor Jeremy Jones, is with regards to the terminology of your article. It's so interesting. I would want to ask firstly, what is your general understanding of the Zimbabwean economy? And what is meant by the term Kukiya? And why did you decide to use this term to describe the Zimbabwean economy?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I point out in the article is that the meaning of Kukiya can be a bit ambiguous, which is probably appropriate to the actions that fall under it. Let me give you some background as to how I approached it, and maybe that will lead to a more interesting discussion of how it applies to the economy, or how it applied to the economy during the period that I was talking about. I was, of course, when I did my fieldwork, I was interested in youth, urban youth in particular, and male urban youth. And at the point that I was writing my dissertation proposal, I was really interested in the way that their everyday lives were affected by the horizon of early death. That is, the horizon of early death that was there in the late 90s and early 2000s due to the AIDS epidemic. And that was sort of set against a literature on African youth that's out there and had been sort of gaining steam throughout the 90s, sort of thinking about the plight, I suppose, of African youth. And I really wanted to think about how their everyday actions interacted with these longer temporal horizons. In that case, the horizon of a life. In the early 2000s, late 90s, life expectancy in Zimbabwe was supposedly in the mid-30s for young men, which is very, very short. So I was interested in how they sort of thought about the things that they did every day vis-a-vis these longer horizons. And those horizons could be future horizons, but also horizons of the past through the sort of narrative of how Zimbabwe came to be what it was in the early 2000s. And remember, you know, that the early 2000s was the period of Hondo Yeminda. So the past was like in people's face, like all the time. Literally on, you know, jingles and television commercials and things like that. It was just the sort of constant drumbeat of the meaning of the past and how it related to the present. So my question was really like, how does that, all of that interact with what people are doing on an everyday basis to earn a living, but also to make a life, as it were. So once I got to Zimbabwe for my actual fieldwork in 2006, this was the period where hyperinflation was really taking off. Inflation had been very bad for a long time before that. We kind of forget that when we talk about it, but you know, the economy had not been great for quite some time. But as I talked to people in the early part of my fieldwork, I found that their discussion, any discussion of AIDS or anything like that, really always turned back to economic conditions in the country, and on, you know, what it meant to sort of get by on an everyday basis. So that's kind of where the impetus for thinking about the economy came from. Now, the way that I did it sort of methodologically is that there were a number of things that I was paying attention to, and this is where Kiya came up. Those days, less so nowadays, but those days people would actually greet each other and respond to greetings by saying Kiya. So it was like literally in the air, like people were talking about it. And as somebody who was, you know, not a fluent Shona speaker, that was something that I had to ask what it meant. You know, initially.
Yeah. I remember those days that somebody would say, "Ziri would say," and then somebody would say, "Andrungo Kiya."
Kiya,
yeah, he's trying
exactly. Or, it's
so
exactly. Something like that.
Exactly.
So I was paying attention to really what you might call, I guess, categories of everyday experience, like the idiom of everyday life. And there were a number of things that came up in that regard, just in living with people. I was living in Chitungwiza at that point during my field work, back in Chitungwiza, because I had lived there before.
Mm-hmm.
So Kiya and all the other words that go along with it, like Chingiriza and so forth, but also Kuvara, straight was another one. Start, start both in the sense of Pekutangira, like somewhere to start, but start as in capital, like I need some kind of
start, money.
Start,
exactly.
Something. Basic commodities, of course, was something that people talked about a lot. The invocation of the term Mazuano these days, like, was something that people used a lot.
Exactly.
And forced by the situation, like I'm forced by any situation. Vita, this, that, and the other. And I was sort of interested in what people meant by force, and I was kind of interested in what they meant by situation as well. What was this situation? So there was those everyday things there, and then I was also tracking it, as you can see in the article. I was tracking it as it sort of these categories appeared in what you might call doxa, especially. Or explicit ideology, so things like the Mai Samba show, other radio shows like Chakuvugita Zimba Matenga. There are these shows from the early 2000s where you saw these things coming up as well. Nakayedu, National Ethos. And the state press in particular, you found a lot of this sort of discourse on these things. So that's really where my interest in it came. It was the goal of any good ethnography is to sort of pay attention to what matters to people. And Kiya and this whole sort of conceptual field that surrounded it was really important. The one other thing that I was paying attention to as I did it, and again, this appears in the article, was a general idiom of negation. Mm-hmm. And that appeared in a lot of ways. Some was just sort of language of things being upside down, topsy-turvy, mm-hmm. But also a lot of metaphors, of bodily metaphors that people used of, I guess, discombobulation, like dakwa, things are drunk.
Exactly.
Sinopinga, mm-hmm. The embodied sense of hardship, that would be things like shakaoma, things are hard, shakadzanya, squeezing. All of this sort of language was what I was paying attention to, and I wanted really to try and make sense of that, mm-hmm. And how really broad set of economic factors sort of, I would say, percolate, but it was more like how they sort of burst into people's everyday life experience. Mm-hmm. And so that was the real impetus for thinking about Kukiya Kiya. I'll say that I picked Kukiya Kiya instead of Chingiriza or whatever for purely alliterative purposes. It just sounds better to say Kukiya Economy. Mm-hmm. But I did, I presented several drafts of this early on. The first was at the Anthropology Southern Africa meeting in 2007. And it was actually completely different. It was a story of some guys crossing the border to Tete, Mozambique. And it doesn't appear in the article at all. But then for this displacement economies conference that was done in 2008, which is where the special issue of JSAS, that's where I presented a more developed version of it.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm pretty sure you had to settle for Kukiya Kiya because it's the most popular saying.
Yeah.
If you were to compare most of these sayings, some of them that you list in your article that were the most dominant sayings during this time, the Kukiya Kiya saying is the one that became so popular, such that when I remember during this time I was in primary school, so it's something that I grew up seeing. It's something that I myself would speak. So my second question for you is that you decide to look at this specific time, that is to say 2000 to 2008. What would you say are the socio-economic and political factors that caused this sweeping spatial temporal shift in Zimbabwe's economic life? In other words, what was unique about these years?
Yeah, I deal with it a bit in this article. Keep in mind that I wrote it quite a while ago. It was interesting rereading it. It's really had an interesting afterlife. I was a graduate student when I wrote it. I certainly did not expect so many people to read it. I might have been more careful if I had thought, which may have been a bad thing. But I think, I mean, there are obvious empirical things that were going on at the time. Hyperinflation, this was, I wrote the paper in the midst of hyperinflation and pretty literally in the midst of hyperinflation because I wrote a lot of it in Harare in early, after the draft in early 2009. Right as dollarization started. So there was that. There was also the obvious thing, which is everything that happened in the early 2000s, the Hondo Yaminda and the sort of political turmoil, I would say, involving ZANU-PF and MDC at that point. And that sort of works its way out right as we were doing that conference at the end of 2008. So those things are pretty obvious, and I think, you know, the way that I've explained it to people before is that there were two revolutions in Zimbabwe in the 2000s. One was the land revolution, and it's hard to look at what happened and what happened to the structure of the economy of Zimbabwe in the 2000s without coming to the conclusion that there was in fact a revolution. I think people have very rosy idea of what a revolution is sometimes. And so there's this debate about terminology, but you know, there was a radical reorganization of the ownership of the economy. That is really important. At the same time, the second revolution really involved the evisceration of the wage or salaried middle class. And that isn't to say they've completely disappeared. It's just that their place in the economy changed quite radically in the 2000s, in part because a lot of them left, huge numbers of people. And so you see a shift in dominant economic form in Zimbabwe from one that sort of circulates around wages and salaries, wages especially, to one that circulates around remittances from people who have left. Huge numbers of people who have left, as plenty of people have written about. So it's hard actually to remember for a lot of us that, you know, in the 90s, not a lot of Zimbabweans left the country. Of course, there was a lot of cross-border trade, but people didn't move out. It was a nice place to be. In fact, there were a lot of people coming to Zimbabwe the way that Zimbabweans go to South Africa or other places now. So those are the two kind of forces that I was thinking about. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who've written much more eloquently about the land issue than I could, and who have better data on it. You know, I was in Chitungwiza. You know, certainly when I was working there in 1999 and 2000, people were seizing the farms that abut Chitungwiza, and some of them are now really part of Chitungwiza for all intents and purposes. But I wouldn't say that I had any special insight into the land issue. Okay. So I sort of set that aside.
On that note, you mentioned that you stayed in Chitungwiza for the first time that you visited Zimbabwe, and then you stayed again at the time that you were conducting this research. What was your experience? What was life like in Chitungwiza at this point in time, comparing it with the life that perhaps you have lived before and you have experienced in other parts of the world?
Well, you know, in the 90s, when I first went there, you know, Chitungwiza isn't a bad place. I mean, you get this sense that an expectation, I suppose, that I, as an American, might have had would be that it's you know, slum-like or something like that, and that's really not the case. You know, it was built and at that point still sort of operated as a dormitory township for people who had jobs in Harare. Those jobs disappeared progressively over the course of the 2000s. So things changed there, and those changes were very material in a lot of ways. I lived there, of course, while I worked there in 1999, 2000, and to give you some idea, you know, we had constant plumbing, hot water, everything worked in our house. The electricity was always on. This was 1990 and 2000. That is certainly not the case all the time now. So you can sort of see this sort of crisis in the sort of breakdown of infrastructure, everyday infrastructure, important things, you know, garbage collection, things like that. That used to happen. Of course, I haven't been there for several years. Maybe it started up again, but I have my doubts. So it's you know, people feel the crisis, these kinds of crises, in very tangible ways. Mm-hmm. Very tangible ways. You experience the crisis in the lack of water. You see people walking with, you know, cans of water on their head, which, you know, they never would have done that in 1998. You know, that nobody did that unless they lived in some place that didn't have water service. So yeah, things have changed quite a lot. The city has also grown immensely, and that was a trend that was already there, going back to the early 90s and structural adjustment, where you had huge numbers of people flooding into Harare and other cities. So these are sort of demographic or structural trends, you know, that are the conditions of possibility for people's everyday life, I guess you could say. So they're what makes possible a life where you have to Kukiya to get by, mm-hmm. As opposed to, you know, getting a job in the industry somewhere in Harare and commuting back and forth, you know. Mm-hmm. That was it was still an aspiration, a reasonable aspiration. I think that people had in the late 90s that I'm not sure they still have. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, sure thing. So if we look at it, many of the things that you write about in this article were merely a manifestation of the informality of the Zimbabwean economy, or this shift from formal means of economic activity to informal means of economic activity. And the trend has not only been particular to Zimbabwe, but has been a characteristic of quite a number of other countries in the Southern African region and even in Africa at large. What would you say about the consequences of this shift to informal kind of economics? What has been the effect of this on African economies at large and Zimbabwe in particular?
Well, you know, the situation in Zimbabwe is in many ways unique to Zimbabwe. It's unique to the history of Zimbabwe. It's unique to certain events that happened in Zimbabwe, like hyperinflation. And I would say that there is a difference between an economy where there are a lot of people involved in the informal economy, and what I term in the paper, or termed in the paper, a Kukiya economy. Because you find informal economies everywhere. In fact, I teach a course on the ethnographies of the informal economy, and I point out to students when I do that, you know, most people, most places, for most of history have not had a formal sector job. It's really a myth that we sort of start with that as the normal form of economic life. It's not. If you look around the world at this point, we're talking about billions of people who make a living in the informal economy, so-called. So, you know, for me, methodologically, what that translates to is sort of thinking about places like Chitungwiza as really being normal, as opposed to, you know, Worcester, where I am now as being the norm of economic life. Still, the difference in Zimbabwe, when I talk about the Kukiya economy, this is my proposal, I suppose, my argument, is that in Zimbabwe, a particular logic of informality is at the very center of economic life. And that's different from other places. In a later publication, in a book on displacement economies, edited by Amanda Hammer, and put out by the Z Press. In that one, I think about it using Michel Desserteau, who I quote in the Kukiya piece, but not extensively. And he has this idea of strategies versus tactics. I'm not sure if you have encountered this. And what he says is that there's a difference between a strategy, because a strategy is something that has a proper place. It operates from a proper place. It's kind of like an army, okay? And he draws the difference from a sort of martial terminology, the language of armies. And he says, strategies have a proper place. They operate from a base, as it were. And in a lot of ways, a formal economy is like that. There's a set of guaranteed things, rule of law, so-called, but a lot of other things that go along with it, like, you know, the regularity of, the presumed regularity of all kinds of services, the coordination of various aspects of the economy, and clear ownership of enterprise, contract, things like that. He's not talking about economic life per se, but I use it that way. A tactic, on the other hand, he uses it to basically talk about what he calls poaching. And people poach from these proper places. And so in a way, the informal economy sort of, in a lot of places, circulates around the formal one, and poaches from it. Okay, or it's based on the circulation of things in the formal economy. And that was certainly true at a certain point in Zimbabwe, that the profits of informality depended on the circulation of formal sector wages, and even formal sector buyers, who would buy things from the informal economy and sell them formally, or things like that. What happened, I propose, over the course of the 2000s, is that this whole sort of nucleus, I suppose, of formality, of strategy, progressively dissolves. And what that means is that everybody is involved in this sort of mutual poaching, which can be, it doesn't have to be violent or even immoral in that sense. You know, it's just that the whole economy is sort of operating on this sort of spinning around very short-term horizons of economic life. And that goes along with a lot of things in Zimbabwe, like the lack of clarity surrounding title to agricultural land. In the early 2000s, it wasn't clear if all these businesses were going to be seized by war veterans and so forth. So there's a sense that in Zimbabwe, informality comes to be the logic of the economy at large, rather than a logic that's constantly operating at the margins of the economy. You see, the way that it does, for instance, here in the US. Okay, there are plenty of informality here in the US, tons of it. Okay, the question is whether the sort of central core of the economy is operates on that logic, or rather on a formal one. Of course, you see that tax evasion and things like that are found right at the height of our economy as well. So
they're the most dominant ones.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
the dominant impediments.
So I don't know. Does that argument? You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah,
It's
sure.
not the. I mean, informality and even the sort of qualities of Kukiya that we talk about. You can find that anywhere,
Yeah.
and there's plenty of literature about it. You know, all over Africa, but beyond Africa as well. If you read like the work of Abdul Malik Samon, you know, he starts in Cameroon, but these days he's talking about very similar kinds of phenomena in Cambodia, in Indonesia. Latin America is obviously quite central to the literature on informality. So those things are common, but economies driven by something like Kukiya, I think that's more, that is not as common. So you find places like Congo, where that has certainly been the case historically. Equatorial Guinea. There's a lot of stuff about this in Cameroon. Just to name some African cases.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. My last question for you is with regards to this argument raised by the neoliberal school of thought that has argued that the informality of these African economies, that is to say Zimbabwe included in particular, is as a result of higher taxes, is as a result of burdensome regulations and controls by the state, is as a result of state corruption and so forth. And they've alternatively argued that economists should try and put in place policies of lowering taxes, of deregulation, and of minimum state intervention in the economy so as to promote growth. And my question to you is that to what extent does this school of thought explain the struggles in Africa and the struggle in Zimbabwe, or perhaps explain the Zimbabwean crisis? And does this kind of solution offer a relevant and a strong solution to this crisis?
I don't believe so. No, is the short answer. There are a number of ways to think about informality, and much as my work, published work, sort of addresses sort of cultural idioms of informality, or social idioms of informality, you might say. At my sort of core, I consider informality to be a structural feature of the economy, and a structural feature of both the longue durée, as you might put it, but also of more global kinds of economic relations. The neoliberal take on informality, which of course was implemented, instrumentalized in the early 90s in Zimbabwe in the form of structural adjustment. It really was the animating force of the policies that were put in place at that point. It takes poverty and the sort of and the features of poverty as being questions of market failure, and I don't think that's true. I think in the context of a place like Zimbabwe was the Zimbabwean economy, and here I think a lot of writers associated with ZANU-PF, to be honest, are correct the Zimbabwean economy was designed as a colonial extractive economy. The goal was to extract profits from the land and from the labor force. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, informality was always there as a way to, I guess, reproduce the labor force. There's a famous article about this in the South African context. I don't know if you've ever come across it, from the 70s by Harold Wolpe, about the way that that rural areas in South Africa were basically designed to reproduce.
I remember that. I remember that.
Reproduce the labor force.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're sort of based on exploitation. Now, the notion that a structure of that sort can be remedied by heroic entrepreneurs, which is the sort of central feature of the neoliberal argument, I just don't find that convincing. And I don't find it convincing even where certain things are obvious. Okay, it's obvious that people would be more likely to register their business if it was easier to do so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's obvious. It's obvious that that there is a dearth of capital, mm-hmm. For people to start small enterprises, and that it's important to have that sort of capital to do it. That's what people in Chitungwiza are talking about when they say, you know, Atina Maria start. Yeah. You know? So I think that's obvious. The question is whether if they had it, the problem would be solved. And I was thinking about this after you asked the question. I mean, when I was still working in Chitungwiza, I attended the World Microcredit Conference, which was held in Harare at the end of 2000, I think. I don't remember the exact date. And it was a big deal. You know, Mohammed Yunus of microcredit fame was there, and I sat next to Zanele and Becky, and it was, you know, it was a big deal. There were a lot of big people who came in. But at that point, the inflation rate in Zimbabwe was in the range of about 20 or 30%. Already at that point, that made things like microcredit very difficult to operate. Mm-hmm. What that means is that entrepreneurs and entrepreneurialism are really subject to much larger macroeconomic forces. If you want to run a micro enterprise and you're borrowing money at 40% interest, your micro enterprise will fail. You know, that's obvious. Nobody in their right mind would borrow money at that rate here for a very risky business opportunity. You know, in the case of the locations in Zimbabwe, you know, one more poultry project is not going to earn you enough money to pay back that kind of interest. It won't. It certainly won't earn it back fast. Mm-hmm. So my sense is that in terms of informality, we really need to think about it in a different way, in a way that addresses the structural contradictions of a national economy and the way that they interact with a much larger global economy. Mm-hmm. Because still, you know, Zimbabwe up till now is at the margins of the global system. It is still money travels the wrong way. Mm-hmm. It is leaving Zimbabwe instead of coming back to it. Mm-hmm. So that is a structural feature which no amount of hard work will solve. Unfortunately, no amount of hard work on the part of, you know, the average Zimbabwean. Zimbabweans are very hard workers. They are. People aren't afraid to work in Zimbabwe. They're not, but that certainly has not solved the economic crisis. So I would look elsewhere, I guess is the short answer to your question. To structural features of informal economies and things of that sort.
Wonderful. Professor Jeremy Jones, thank you very much for joining me on the conversation for today's episode. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics, with international newsmakers to discuss about the issues affecting the continent and on the political economy of development in Africa, the way forward and the alternative. Thank you very much for joining me and have a good day.
Thank you.
Wonderful.